All right. Hello, everyone. We are here for yet another Conversations in Agave talk. Susan Koss with Mezcalistas. I always forget to do the introduction of myself at the beginning. But I'm really excited to be talking to Salvador Chavez from La Luna Mezcal. I will probably go back and forth between calling you Sal and Chava. It's the two things just come naturally here. But in coming up with different ideas for the talks, I was like, the one thing we really haven't talked about in general over the years is fermentation. And fermentation is such an important thing in the role of, or in the production of making mezcal. And on top of it, I love fermented products. So I'm
Me
kind of
too.
a little bit of a geek when
Yeah.
it fermented things. And then like the even better kind of layer to it all is having you on to talk about fermentation, especially given where your mezcal comes from, Cotija, the fact that it is cheese country in Michoacan, and it really just gives us a different like kind of perspective and opportunity to talk about flavors and process and place, and all of those kind of different things. And it's like I think I'm pretty sure that everybody on this call in particular knows different fermented products, but
Yeah.
like to remind people that cheese is a fermented product.
Hmm.
It's not just sauerkraut, it's not just kimchi, it's not those things that we just think about. It's like dairy products are fermented.
Yeah.
So anyhow, that's my little like intro there to say, yay, I'm so excited to talk about this. So welcome.
Thank
Uh,
you very much. Thank you.
yep. And you're just back from a big trip to Michoacan
Yeah.
where you opened your brand new Venato.
Yeah. It's one of our, it's our newest one. It's in Indaparapel. We were already producing there using a vinata of a friend that wasn't using his. And so we were in use there. But then we were across the street building ours in the meantime. And this last trip was to inaugurate it. So it was fun. It was festive. It was tough because even because we invited a lot of like the local government and to thank them for their support. And so we definitely had to have a lot of COVID protocol in place in order to be allowed to do it in the first place, because there's a lot of restrictions in Mexico right now as cases are increasing. And so, from face masks to temperature checks before people got in to tables being certain distances, sanitizer, all that stuff. It was all required. It was mandated, and it was good, I think, because the last thing we wanted to do was really get anyone sick. And lastly, our team as well, a lot of young folk there on our team. And so we didn't want to compromise, but we also didn't want to stop. We had it on the schedule for quite some time. And Hippocrates came from the CRM. So it was kind of like, okay, the timing was that we had to do it for a lot of different reasons. And so we did it, and it was fun. I thought it was well managed, and more importantly, I just thought, the same reason everyone was excited for us was the same reason I was excited. We've been able to really create quite a few jobs in that area that's kind of remote, and I would say very remote. It's remote enough that there's not a lot of jobs there, and so to be able to do this, and I think we have a very young team too, which is also kind of exciting. A lot of young youth that some of them have had high school education, some have tried college. Some maybe are in college, and so it's cool for them as well to feel like they're a part of a company. And for them, we make up kind of an international company feel, because they know the product that they're labeling and bottling and putting the stickers on, all that stuff. They're coming to the U.S., and so for them, it's special from that perspective as well. So it's nice.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you
Because
very
it's kind
much.
of insane to do that in the midst of
I
a
know.
pandemic. So,
Yeah.
salute to that.
Yeah. Cheers. Cheers. Yeah. Cheers to that.
Cheers.
Yeah. The fact that we got it done, I was happy about it.
Mhm.
But yeah,
But
so it was nice. And to your point, the other vinata, one of the other ones is in Cotija, Michoacan. It's on my family's estate where my father was born, where my father grew up, my uncles and aunts. And so even today, I took, knowing that we were having this conversation, I took advantage, and my grandparents live in Petaluma, which is 30 minutes from me. And so I drove over to say hi, and with a little distance in place as well, because they're, there's concern because they're of their age. But I brought them some of the cheese that I gave you as well, because my grandpa loves it. Grandpa used to make it. Brought him a little bottle of mezcal to sip on with me, and then also I left it behind for him to sip on afterwards. I actually have some cool videos. I'll shoot them to you
Oh,
later. Check them out.
cool.
It's fun. His stories are funny.
Yeah. Well, I was pretty excited when that hunk of cheese arrived in the mail, and the hysterical thing was, Salad said, "Oh yeah, I brought some cheese back with me from my trip. I'll send you a little sample so you can really see what it tastes like." And so I'm thinking, oh, this little sample, and this giant hunk arrived. And it was like,
the
this
pieces
is
are big.
amazing.
Yeah, the wheels of cheese are huge there, and it seems like everyone's using the same kind of mold setting for the cheese, and they're massive. I mean, even me bringing it back, I had a box with a rope around it it was heavy and it was big. So, but I mean, I got it back. I have a bunch still in my house, and I give some to my dad, give some to my grandparents, now yourself, one of my partners who lives in Chicago. Sent him, he's never had it, and he's like, hey, I really want to try it. So I sent it out with yours came with ice packs, right?
Right, exactly. So yeah, you're gonna start getting hit up with a bunch of these questions here, like,
Yeah.
hey, I'll take some.
I know. There's gonna be crumbles, maybe like this size, just a little nuggets.
Yeah, well, I mean, I had completely forgotten when you said, you had a wheel, like, because Parmesan wheels are gigantic as well. And I went in with a group of people a few years ago to buy a whole wheel from somebody who was coming back from the region. And, and it was just like, how are we even going to cut this? It's like, do we get the table saw? Like, what do we do? But it was, a very, a beautiful thing, and to have it last for as long as it did, because they froze it too, it's like you can freeze it. But okay, so let us dive into this a little bit. So your family were cheesemakers.
Yeah, well, the Chavez side of my family still to date. There's my tío Crescencio, a relative of my grandfather. I think it's first cousin. He won the prize last year for best cheese, and it's it's something that a lot of people do now in Cotija. Some of them are taking on different practices, a lot of agriculture there, but a lot of them just dive into some of the traditions of the area, including like I have a cousin who makes mezcal and also makes cheese, and in Batian, so different side of the hillside. So all of this combined, it's a part of the family history. My grandfather did as well. The Chavez, once again, the Chavez side, because my family's Chavez Figueroa from that region, and the Chavez side was known for the cheese making. And so, and even today, going to talk to my grandfather, it was kind of like running through some of his memories of what he would do when he was young. He's 84 now, so he's talking about when he was a kid, and working with the cows that they use to then make the cheese, and also the simplicity of it. I think my perspective of what I wanted to really kind of touch on again was, I always find it fascinating, a lot of times in this world of mezcal, in the world of cotija cheese, the correlations is that we're going to be making today, but really just from the standpoint of why they did what they were doing, right? Like, what was it that taught you that, and for why do it that way? And it was, really revolves around tradition, right? That's how they learned it. There's really no other thought going on in their head of how you can make it quote unquote better. It's like, this is how we've done it. This is how I learned. And for me, like my question was around la cuajada, right? Like, what's going to actually make the cheese start separating, and understanding, like, okay, now you can buy the liquid and they simply just use that. And my grandmother was telling me that she uses it to make chongos. Chongos are from Zamora, and my favorite dessert, and you use sugar for that as well. So all of these things combined, like, why do it that way? How did you do it that way? And then lastly, what did you do before that liquid existed? And so it was interesting to understand what they said it was, like the intestine of the cow or intestines of a deer, and they would let it steep in water with salt, and that would be the composition of the liquid they would use to put into the milk so that it would start curding. So it's just fascinating. It's really fascinating to understand it, but also even for them, like, conceptually, it's not necessarily that they knew. Like, my grandpa, even today when we were talking about it, I was like, oh yeah, at that point it's fermenting and it's creating more flavors. And he's kind of like, what are you talking about? I know that, like, he was like, that's not really what we were looking for. We knew what it was. Like, we added salt, then we compacted it. For them, it was removing all the suero or the whey, and then it was placing it to dry out. And I was like, okay, how long did you wait? Oh, at least 2 months, but usually longer, so it tastes better. And it was just like, once again, the mentality of process that was really just traditional. But for me, it was understanding that at that point, there's more flavor being created from a fermentation that's going on inside of the cheese. And so it's just kind of curious, you know, it's cool for me to sit on both sides and understand my grandfather's mentality around what he would do, and then also the scientific side. And that was actually really cool about listening with Ivan and hearing the perspective. It's like you have the tradition, which obviously he really respects, but then he also has a science behind it and why things are happening. And I think we're going to go more and more towards understanding both things because there's a knowledge base out there for it.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it is really interesting. And I think when you use a word like fermentation or ferment, people get like, oh my God, we're introducing bacteria. Bacteria is scary. And, you know, I make my own sauerkraut, and sauerkraut is ridiculously easy to make, especially when you're in the right climate, you know, to do it. And it's just like, slice up the sauerkraut, add salt, macerate it with your hands so you're able to release the liquid, and then put it in a glass container or a crock and let it do its thing. And you can scrape off, like, you know, that crazy looking stuff that bubbles up to the top and everything like that. And everybody's just like, but can it kill you? And I'm just like, no. You know? I'm like, my grandparents never said anything about anybody dying from it, you know. So I think you probably, if the flavor was off, the flavor would be off. But you know, and I ran a food festival in which we would do these major things like crowd-a-thons, you know, where a whole group of people would get cabbage and learn how to make sauerkraut right there. And you know, and it's the most fascinating and complex part of a process, and that is the part where you're introducing so much flavor, and yet it's truly simple, you know. And I'm sure that's, you know, in talking to your grandfather, it was that same kind of thing of him just being like, well, you just do this and it happens.
Yeah, it's exactly, it's like the way that they see it as simplicity, I think is what's really curious, because we understand how much complexity goes into it. Like for him, he was mentioning to me how one of the big rules with his father and mother, when, you know, after he'd milked the cow to have the milk ready for it, was how clean the area had to be, that they had to wash their hands before they started doing, like, it was the lack of bacteria that they wanted really to start the process. But then within that process, they introduced bacterias. Right. And so it's just curious, I've also heard those same things with a lot of mezcaleros, where the issues that they've had with wood fermenters in the past, or something that's not neutral like stainless steel, you know, that's why it's so alluring to them to a certain degree to try to make the transition, because they're like, oh, well, we've had trouble because there's bacteria within the creases of the wood and it's stuck there. And if you don't clean that well enough, then it's going to affect your next batch. And for, you know, so it's like, it might throw it off, right? Or it might kill the fermentation. So there's so many factors that they're looking at almost differently, to then lastly for us being like, oh, bacteria is a friend, right? Bacteria's flavor, or can be, in the process that the things are going through, is kind of what we end up salivating over, you know, what we're ultimately so excited to try. And the funkiness, and really some of the mezcales that we've done in Cotija do have a certain lactic quality to it that's a lot more present than when we do it in a tucuaro or when we do it in the parapel, which that's what's kind of fun about how us doing things, because it's the same team, you know, moving from site to site. And really at the same time, it's like, it's different native yeast or different bacteria that are really influencing the same makeup. Like if we're doing a 50-50 ensamble of manso and chino in Cotija, and we do it in the parapel, naturally they taste so different, you know. They're different. And yes, there's so many other variables, of course, but you know, at the end of the day, like a lot of the ambient yeast, ambient area is what's going to be influencing the ultimate product. And I think that'll be really fascinating in the future when we actually have more labels and representations from those areas of the same stuff. So people are like, oh, I tried that one, it tastes like this, and tried this one. Almost same times, a lot of times, you know, we're trying to produce when it's not raining, when it's not as cold, because those factors also are going to be taken into consideration for the fermentations being slower or different or what have you. A lot of times, a lot of the agave farmers that we work with, or ourselves, if it's on our estates, we don't want to harvest in the water for many factors. One, because accessibility is damaged, right? Because a lot of times it's like dirt roads, brechas as we call them, and they get destroyed with the rain. You know, they get destroyed, and it's really hard to go in there with a truck, 4x4 even, to access the area to harvest properly. And then lastly, there's also the concept of the agave being full of water and not so much sugars, and so the difference in that. And the fermentation, you know, could take longer because it's colder and it's windy and so many other factors. You're not controlling those factors. You really can't in the open air.
Right. And as we learned, the longer the fermentation process, the higher the methanol levels, you know, are going to be, which impacts how you balance that out at the end.
And true more for us with Bruto. I think Bruto might be our most challenging agave to work with on a personal level because of this factor. Like a lot of agaso, a lot of weight, not a lot of sugar. And then to your point, right? Like that's why on our batches we'll typically stimulate or activate with pulque of the same agave to kind of get those bacteria going faster. Almost like a starter, right? Like if we were making un pie de levadura, but it's not. It's really just an addition of its same ferment from the aguamiel that it has, because we kind of need it, especially if it's kind of cold. We're not really going to be able to yield much at all, but definitely not really create a proper fermentation for our happiness, I guess you could say.
Yep. And so in doing that, do you kind of create a mother pulque that you continue to use throughout different fermentation processes, or is it like a fresh pulque start? I ask because like in San Luis Potosi, they have to start with a pulque, and that has mostly to do with the intense temperature variations.
Correct.
But they have their mother barrel that they use that's, you know, is continue. I mean, it's like kind of like your sourdough starter.
Yeah, we don't have a continuous use of it. It's not really in our practice. Sometimes we have, like when we're in the Parapeo where Bruto is not as common, we'd have to go up to Queréndaro or Rio de Paras or somewhere where Bruto is a little more existent and work and buy some pulque from a family to use to bring down. So they might be continuous with it, but we're not. That's really not something that we're doing, and more so something that just helpful to us, but not that we're constantly taking consideration. I actually went to San Luis Potosí as well to kind of witness it. I went to Campanilla and seeing their style, but like they have to for so many other reasons, right? Like there's so many factors up there that are just wild that of how they produce such amazing liquid, for how they do it, you know, even from their distillation, just watching it, like, kind of what the hell. But yeah, so we're it's not a common thing for us. It's more so when we're making those batches to acquire some fresh pulque.
Yeah, interesting. And so, like in the fermentation process with the cheese, like talk about that a little bit.
Well,
you know.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because it you know, kind of again, you know, correlating it or relating it to mezcal. A lot of those lactic qualities, a lot of the flavor development happen in the same stage because fermentation for cheese is going to happen in the initial part as well, because milk has sugars to it, and so naturally it's going to create fermentation within that for those sugars. But then once you've dried it out and compacted it to then let it age, that's typically kind of what I would call your anaerobic stage, and so it's going to happen inside. And because a lot of times, like my grandpa was saying today, part of their job once they're letting it rest is that they're coming in with a wet towel and wiping it off of its mold. And once again, it's just a simple fact to him. It's like, oh, it's mold. But for me, I'm thinking, okay, well, if fermentation's active as hell, obviously, if mold's being created consistently, but it's kind of like a fact that, you know, you're like, I asked him, I said, so what in your opinion is different from the time that you try, because they're going to give it a taste when it's still wet. So then when you let it dry, cuando lo dejas añejar, right, when it's going to be, and you know, coming from a place where typically speaking, we're putting cheese in the fridge, you know, like you want to preserve it in that sense. And even to me, like for my paranoia, I brought this cheese back from Mexico and I cut it because it's huge, right? And I put half the wheel in the freezer, and then half of it I left out, and that's what I sent to you. That's more like, I would call it fresh because I never froze it. But like my grandpa was like, you don't gotta freeze it. Like you don't gotta do that, because they're like, we never did. Like we just left it out. And yes, the climate in that room might have been a little bit colder or whatever, but it was just sitting in that room drying out and coming hard, right? Because it is soft. And my grandma was actually telling me that they take the suero that they call it, all the wetness from the cheese when it's extracting it out, come to the top, and then they reboil it. And she was telling me you reboil it, and then you add, and then it starts bubbling, kind of like a ferment, starts bubbling. Then you add some more cold, and it becomes like a wet cheese that's not salted. And so they typically use that and add like a piloncillo syrup as a requesón, and that's a different cheese that they make from, so it's like a derivative of the actual cotija cheese. I found it fascinating. And you know, so going back to your question, on the anaerobic stage of fermentation for mezcal, once the kind of cap is created on the top of each tina, at that point, you're very well ready to distill, potentially, right? Depending on what you're tasting, et cetera. But at that point, oxygen is cut off. So everything that's inside still is still consuming a lot of the residual sugar that maybe didn't convert properly during the aerobic stage. And that's the same thing that's kind of going on with the cheese. It's like, and because a lot of times that's where a lot of the flavor development's happening, a lot of layers of flavor. And, you know, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, a lot more of the lactic quality, maybe gets a little bit thicker, all that stuff, right? So I think those are the relationships between the cheese and the mezcal that really leading up to this conversation was like fascinating to me, and like really understanding it conceptually. I'm like, oh shit, there's way more similarities than I had even know. Maybe a lot of people here already know.
I never assume that I know everything, you know, where it's just like, not. You know, every time I go to Mexico, I'm like, I learned at least 3 new things. One time I had an opportunity, I had met a woman in the market in Oaxaca, and she invited me out to her ranchito in Etla to watch her make cheese. She had the most amazing requesón I'd ever had. Yeah. And, you know, and it was such a fascinating thing. And I was like, oh my God, I'm going to go. And, you know, I understood how cheese was made, but it was just like seeing it live, you know, was pretty incredible. And also, you know, just again, the use of the fresh milk, which completely changes the flavor. You're not
unpasteurized. Yeah. Like, yep. Yes. Yeah. Definitely. I think that's one thing that just like really listening to it, it's curious to think that unpasteurized milk is more favorable for the flavor of the ultimate flavor, right? The layers of flavor that you're going to create with your cheese versus it being, I guess, altered, right? Like fresh milk to then being pasteurized or boiled or what have you. I thought that was really cool to understand because, you know, but then again, in our country, it's not very common or good or kosher really to do unpasteurized anything, right? So
yeah,
which is part of the reason we don't benefit from real cotija cheese is because of the laws in place and the lack of pasteurization. It's almost a lack of ability to be able to actually bring that real cheese over here.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. So I'm, you know, this is when I'm going to be like, okay, so I have my plate of cheese. The first difference that I noticed with the cheese that you had sent me was how it crumbles.
Yeah.
You know, like even trying to slice it, there's no like slicing it, you know, because it just like it crumbles. There's delicious crystals in it as well. Mm-hmm. It is so, you know, earthy and musky, you know, and that's the milk coming through right there. Like that is the fresh milk flavor. And, you know, and balanced like really well with the salts. It's really tasty. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and suddenly I'm just like, oh yeah, all those recipes that call for cotija cheese. Now I know why, like, you know, that cheese would so change the flavor of whatever dish that was. And so then, you know, I also picked up some cotija cheese at the market.
Yeah.
And it's the cacique, you know, cacique is fine when it comes to the basics and everything like that. And up until I tasted your cheese, I would have been like, oh yeah, it's fine. You know, I can use this, but it's much easier to slice. You can get a wedge.
Tastes whole. Yeah.
It tastes like salty aged queso fresca.
Okay. That makes sense.
You know.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit squeaky.
Uh-huh.
You know, as if it was a fresh cheese, as compared to the cheese that you sent me. We would, in our family, we would call it snappy, you know, because it's got like a nice snap to it in the flavor, and also in the texture. So my grandmother used to drive for miles and miles and miles in Western Maryland looking for her favorite snappy cheese, which was super sharp cheddar cheese. And
there,
you know,
the funny thing was, and my grandma, when I gave it to her today, like there was no sense of looking for a wedge. All she did was grab, it was more like a looking like a spoon play just to keep on crumbling it off because we were just grabbing little piece by little piece and doing it. And she gave me some soup today, and she's like, "Oh, add some cheese to it, like this cheese to it," and it was like, really, because it adds some really good saltiness to it as well.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like, I actually have a really interesting relationship with cotija cheese because at one point in my life, I despised it. This is when I was younger because every year my father would take me and my sister. We had a truck with a camper shell in the back, and we would drive from Sonoma, California, all the way to Cotija. And on the drive there, it was fine. It's whatever. It took some days. And on the way back, though, we would always load the truck with goods, and a lot of it was cotija cheese. So for 3 days, I would sit in the trunk of this truck, closed windows, trying to sleep with all this funkiness coming into my nose. And so I got so tired of it. I was like, this is ridiculous. But as I grew up, especially as my palate developed and I started craving kind of more funk, and then I started definitely pairing it with mezcal, I was like, this is the ticket, and I felt now I can't get enough of it. Right. So kind of share that now with my family.
No, I mean, it's true. Like I think back on the amount of stinky cheese that has been in my refrigerator over the years, and the roommates who hated me for it, and it was like kind of the same thing with kimchi as well. I still think back on this. Like I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and this was in the 80s, not at a time when kimchi was found everywhere, and yet they had kimchi in Madison, and I loved it. And my roommates were just like, "Oh yeah, that stays on the back porch. There's no bringing that in." But they were fine with the blue cheese. That was okay. The stinky blue cheese.
That's interesting. Yeah.
But yeah, and I mean, it is, So then, how with mezcal, like, was there ever seen as like a relationship between the two products, or
besides drinking it side by side, which is really like the history of what got me started in what I'm doing today, was that like thought when I was growing up, going to Cotija as a young kid, it would always be my dad, my grandparents, my uncles, all sipping mezcal, and typically in that region it's all bruto, and eating cheese, like just side by side, bite, sip, bite, sip, bite, sip. And so that really was the thought that I was like, okay, I'm going back and doing this thing. That's the only relationship I really ever saw with it. And even after today and talking to my grandpa about the kind of relationship, I'm not sure it clicked all the way, because a lot of times my family was not involved in producing mezcal. They were produced in the barter, trade and barter, which was my grandpa had the land with the vegetables and everything. And we had a lot of bruto on that land. And so the mezcalero would come and harvest his maguey, take it, and then the exchange was he'd bring back my grandpa bruto mezcal, now, mezcal, and that's what they would be sipping on. So that was the relationship so they weren't really a part of the process, because even sometimes when I asked them about the process of mezcal and their interpretation, I found some things after being so involved. I'm like, that's a little off. Like, that's not how it goes down, but I mean, they were pretty spot on, but a lot of times it was a little bit off. Like, that's not really how it works. But that was a relationship that there were more consumers at that level, but it wasn't consumers like they were buying it. It was consumers like they were just trading. So that was the only relationship they saw. But today it seems very obvious how much relationship there really is. And especially, I would say the quality of cheese that's going on there, and all of the bacteria and the components that make up cotija cheese really influence our fermentations tremendously, to then create these flavor profiles that where a lot of people will taste our product and be like, oh, this is kind of cotija cheese funky, right? Like, there's a lot of those factors, I think, playing into mezcal. In a lot of times salinity people would describe as well, which I think is a factor of it. And then obviously, yes, some cheesy and funkiness is pretty prevalent for the products of that area. Not just ours. I mean, I've tried other mezcaleros in that region, delicious and layered, and definitely some funk to it for sure. And I think I was when Ivan was talking about in the last conversation about methanol, that if you ferment too long or longer, you're going to create some of what he deemed the funky flavors. And it's the same thing if you think about the aging of cotija cheese. To them, it's making it hard, but the reality is the longer it's aging, almost the more flavors it's going to have. Like, I don't know. I didn't ask what the aging of this particular cheese was, but my best guess is it was a while, because even my grandpa thought this was delicious. He's like, oh, this is really good cheese. Whoever made this does a really good job. I'm like, oh, shit, he usually doesn't compliment much. There's not a lot of compliments coming out of his mouth. So it was really good cheese. It's really good cheese. And my grandma's preference and when talking to her was that she actually liked fresh cheese more than she liked hard cheese like this. So she liked having the cheese right after it was set, before it started getting firm. Like they would have a little bit made of fresh cheese.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes I fall more on that side, but I have definitely come to appreciate more like the intense flavors of like an old aged Gouda or an old aged, like a Parmesan
Yeah.
as well,
Yeah.
because I feel like a lot of the Parmesan that we get here is more on the fresher side and
Yeah.
not like that super aged and really dry, where you're getting those incredibly like dense flavors. Well, I mean, I'm curious as to, was there much overlap? Did you ever notice between families that were producing cheese? Were they also producing mezcal? Was it kind of a family income, or were they pretty separate processes? I mean,
It seemed
like
pretty
this
separate.
family, this, yeah.
It seemed, I felt like what my cousin Rafa, who produces on the opposite side of the Sierra in Cotija, I was shocked, a little surprised when he told me, oh yeah, I also make cheese. But from him, the way he said it and the way it was kind of described, it felt like more like a economic play. Like he was like, okay, I learned the practice, I can make cheese and sell cheese. And then I can also sell mezcal, and everything he makes is for local consumption, which is kind of cool. Like the mezcal, because even with our presence there, they were kind of like, oh, you're going to take away our market. I said, I promise you guys. I said, I'm not going to try to sell local because that's not my game. Like, I don't want to try to mess up your guys's, your wallets. Like, that's not our goal. Like, our goal is to try to represent the region. And to the point of more relationship now between mezcal and cheese is talking to the local municipality, the president, is this concept of working with people who are bringing people to Mexico because they always have a Festival del Queso, and they do it, La Feria del Queso, they do it in the plaza. And the plaza really in Cotilla, because it's such a small town, is where it's at. Like, that's where everyone's circling on the weekends. The church is right there, which is just like the key component of the town. Huge church. And all the locals go there. So they do the queso, the Feria del Queso there in the plaza. And so now the concept is, okay, let's bring a group of people that love mezcal, bring them to some of the local vinatas where, like, untied to us, really, we go support them and then go to ours at the very end. Well, hopefully, my hope is that the people go buy the bottles of the local mezcaleros, and then we all go down to town with our bottles and we enjoy the cheese at the plaza and drink mezcal. And so, but the tie-in now would be that they see an opportunity with La Ruta to bring in people from a tourism standpoint to really start tying the gap between both. And I think that there'll be a lot of findings because of that in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is very interesting. I remember several years ago doing an informal kind of mezcal and cheese tasting, and people were like, "That's a really weird pairing," and I'm like,
Yeah.
"No, it's not too weird. I mean, and people just like, no, that seems like a little weird." And it was fun to play around with the different mezcals, and Raza Zaidi with Oaxaca mezcal was there, and and just kind of seeing what went with what. But more to the point, it's like, of course they would pair well together. And there's so much incredible cheese in Mexico that a lot of people in this market here don't know about because it doesn't come here. And some of the most amazing goat cheese I've ever had has been in Oaxaca, where it's like, holy cow, this is really delicious.
Quesillos, delicious.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that, and then, like just the Sonoran and Chihuahuan cheeses are pretty interesting. I mean, it's like, so of course these products would pair well. Cheese and wine pairs well. Why would we think that mezcal wouldn't pair well when, as you said, there's these natural flavor components that have to do with the terroir, the yeast, the bacteria that are present
in the area,
that are creating these flavors.
Really our love with terroir and what we talk about with terroir is really the definition of what, this conversation to a certain degree. It's all that influence that's happening on both sides of the spectrum with mezcal and cheese. I actually in Sonoma conducted a full pairing of our line with cheese, only cheese. Like we didn't serve any food that day. We did an appetizer in the beginning with a cocktail, like welcome, but everything else was cheese. And people were like, this isn't going to work. And they tried it and they were floored. They're like, this was amazing. Like they were still a little hungry afterwards, naturally. So because there wasn't enough cheese to make them full, but the pairing experience for them was amazing because they were so used. I mean, I think that my fascination with fermentation, not so much that I know the science as well as I should, or that I don't consider myself an expert at all, but I come from an area where, if you think about it, we're on the map, Sonoma, California, right next to Napa. We're on the map for a liquid product that 100% is flavor profiles attributed from fermentation because you don't distill it, right? And I think that for me, that was a fascination going into this, was how much important lies in the fermentation, you know, because we always focus a lot on distillation. What do you distill with? How do you distill? What, you know, what's your receptor? What's you know, what's your condenser? All of those factors, they matter a lot. Like, don't get me wrong, but I've always been so fascinated with the flavor creation in your fermentation, because this area kind of taught me that fermentation led to the final product of grapes here, which was wine. You know, that's where it was at. So, you know, I really enjoyed it to the point where watching it in our process, like one of the things sometimes, you know, with certain expressions is we're cooking the agave, which is really the process to create the simple sugars. So the moment that you're getting the agave out and the simple sugars are present, it technically can ferment in a whole cluster, because it's going to start attracting everything that's ambient for that creation. So leaving it rest, it's the same thing as cheese when you actually mold it, which is there's going to start creating some mold around it, which is hongos, right? Like onguear, which is it translates to mushrooms, but it really is just like the mold, which can be scary, can be deemed nasty to a certain degree or gross, but it actually is a lot of the flavor we end up loving, right? It's a lot of the flavor. So before we macerate, we'll leave it whole clusters. We'll let it start fermenting in a dry state before we macerate to enter into the tinas to then add water. And, you know, a lot of times, like when people really like our product, I'm like, well, shit, very well could be because of all the process that we went through. Nothing to do with distillation. You know, yes, the cuts that we take, how we distill, what temperatures, you know, how we're controlling the fire with wood, like too heavy is not good. You know, the conversation was being had around, you know, distilling too fast could be very detrimental. Distilling slower may be very positive, but it takes longer. All of these factors, right? Like they're taken into consideration, but like fermentation really can be the big play here.
Yep. I mean, I remember when I was, I'm trying to remember the town that I went. I think it was in Oaxaca in San Vicente, Coatlan. And this is in Ajutla. They have their distillation style, you know, that is the single distillation.
Yeah.
So the flavor is already a little different in their mezcal. But one of the mezcaleros, like I tried it and I was just like, okay, so this is a pechuga? And he's like, no, why would you say that? And I'm like, because it has a very different flavor. Like, did you add something to it? Like, did you add any herbs or anything? And he, you know, he's looking at me like I'm crazy. And he's like, no, like, why would you say that? And I'm like, because there's a layer of flavor here that I can't identify. And, you know, and finally, after talking it through, somebody else was like, oh, you're tasting the mold. Because he had a practice where he would let his cooked agave sit for a while before, you know, like he would crush it or ferment it. And that just added this additional flavor profile to it. And I was like, see, I'm not crazy. Like, I'm not crazy that I could pick up this, you know, different
extra flavor. Yeah. The additional layer, right? Like, I mean, that's really the beauty of it. I think that it's, all of those factors kind of end up crawling into the bottle that we end up loving, and for different reasons, right? Like, I don't think that there's going to be a point where anyone says this has too much flavor or too many layers. It's like, that's like the most fascinating thing, especially at different ABVs, right? Like that's what's been so cool about working to try to accomplish like I always tell people, like, it might not be that our historic taste is Mexico's historic taste, but definitely from a prideful standpoint, I want our mezcal to make my family happy from their historic flavor profile. Like, I want them to say, oh, this reminds me of mezcal we drank, because that makes me proud, right? So, and a lot of times that ends up being what a lot of people love our mezcal. They'll be like, oh, this has a lot of great flavors to it. And we try to, you know, we work hard to try to accomplish that for sure. but it's those small nuances and like adding the pulque for the bruto or letting the agave rest post cooking, all those factors. I see. I think there's the question here with the right
with Chris, yep,
right?
who wants to know what you found the cheeses
for the
pair
pairing.
best. Yeah.
So two things to that. One, I think it really matters what, not so much the agave, but where it was produced for us. Like if we had a Manto Saguayo that we produce in Cotija, it inevitably tastes different than what we've done in the Parapeo or Tucuaro. So to Chris's question, I would say first and foremost, tasting it would help me on a personal level decide. But I remember specifically with the batches that we did, so our original batches that most people that have tried to know our brand, like the first batches of Manso, first batches of Bruto. I remember specifically for the tequilana, we did queso fresco, which queso fresco doesn't have a lot of flavor, but what I really enjoyed about that queso fresco for the tequilana was that I felt like our tequilana had a lot of like creaminess to it, like thickness, viscosity, and it really went well with the creaminess and thickness of queso fresco, because it's usually creamy and thick and you're biting into it. So that was one of them. The Manto Saguayo, the first batch of it that we did, actually had a lot of people would say it had a lot of cotija cheese like flavor to it, but the irony was that we produced it in Tucuaro, which I was like, that's funny. But that one we did Gruyere, because definitely we did not have any cotija cheese at the time. I didn't bring any up at that point. And then what else did we do? We did a sharp cheddar for the Bruto. That particular one, I just felt like just went well with a lot of the, like, to me, the Bruto is usually very agave flavor forward. Like that's like a dominant taste, and it really went well. And then what was the other one we did? The Chino we did with, I want to say, what was it? I'll get back to you on that one. I forget which one it was, but it went really well though. They were all white cheeses, that's for sure. They were all white cheeses. And it was, like I said, I think that it would matter now if like the new batches come up, what those taste like, to then define what cheese might be the best one for it, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the most fun to just buy a whole bunch of different types of cheeses and just play around, and get it figured out. But then again, cheese is my crack. So like, I am always happy to overindulge on cheese. But, and then just kind of as you play around with the flavor and what works with what.
Yeah, for sure.
So highly enjoyable on that. I mean, but I want to go back to the fermentation with mezcal, which we have the opportunities in the fermentation process to taste it at the different stages.
Yes.
See like how it's going.
Yeah.
It's something that's harder to do with cheese.
Yes.
That's
without messing up the whole thing. Yeah, you really can't do it. Yeah, mezcal is it's funny because it's one of those things where like when working with Higi or Hernan or Adan, Higi's dad, Isidro was always kind of like, wait, but what are you looking for? Like what, because a lot of times I have a weird like I would call it almost like dichotomy. Because one side of me, like I work with Sergio Cruz. Sergio Cruz is a master distiller for 1414. He's one of my best friends in Mexico at this point. Business partner, all these things. So from when I talk to him, it's so scientific. Like it's so scientific. It's very deep. I consider him like one of the most talented people in the industry. He's so smart and he makes really good stuff and he knows how to make really good stuff. And then taking it to talking to Higi or Hernan, and it's more like, oh no, we're tasting this, and once it tastes like beer, like agave beer, like we feel like it's ready, so we'll let it go like 2 more days, and like they're just such like sensory factors used to then like scientific factors and maybe more tools and what have you. But understanding both, I think, is kind of fun because I never negate that they're making great products, so it doesn't matter to me. I'm like, cool, like do your thing, but with Sergio, he kind of will define it. Oh, that probably happened because of XYZ, or talking about methanol and the fibers and all these compositions of what could happen. He was even telling me how some yeast, like, the fact is that we're cooking agave to break all the chains of carbohydrates to make the simple sugars. But he's like, some yeast within the fermentation, certain yeast could build those chains back up, right? And increase methanol and blah, blah, blah. So like it's cool just to like understand both sides of it. And that was kind of like, I felt the conversation, although Eric didn't maybe dive in so much into the specifics of fermentation. It was like, you know, Eric kind of represented what I would be like mezcalero side, and Ivan was representing the science side, which was really cool.
Yeah. And for those of you on the call, this was a talk that we had very spontaneous during the week on methanol and traditional mezcal production. And we have the recording to that, the link to that recording. We'll have it on our website soon. It's definitely on our Facebook page. And I might have sent it, I can't even remember on Friday. What did I do? If I sent it out in the reminder email with a link to that, you know, that was 4 days ago. The heat kind of fried my brain. So I have no idea what I was doing over the weekend. But well, I mean, so fermentation and those tanks, what I have heard sometimes from mezcaleros is that while they will clean the tank between batches, they're not going to really clean the tank because they like that accumulation of the yeast that are in there.
I agree. I mean, I love that concept. Like, you know, the concept of being fearful of bacteria killing your next fermentation. I'm much less scared of that. You know, I that's fascinating to me. I think that's kind of where my mentality would lie, is that let's not pressure wash them. Let's see, you know, let's let those bacteria influence the next batch, especially if you found them very favorable. I'd be like, well, something was really nice in there.
Right. Well, I mean, it sometimes makes me wonder if the things that have become like, you know, tradition and the practice, this is how you do it. Like, did that not fully cleaning the tank out come from laziness one time, you know, where it's just like, I don't want to deal with this right now. I don't have the time. I just, you know, it's like how these things kind of come about in and of themselves is kind of interesting, you know. And you know, with my grandmother, who was a cook, her mother passed away when she was, I think, in 7th grade. And as the oldest girl in her family, she had to take over the mom role, and suddenly became the cook and getting her 6 other siblings, you know, to school and all that other stuff. And she was, you know, as all of our grandmothers are, the best cook in the entire world.
Yeah.
Nobody made anything as good as her. And, you know, and trying to get recipes from her was always this fascinating kind of exercise in futility, you know, where it would just be like, okay, so how are you, like, how much of this should I use? And she's like, you know, it's just a pinch. It's just a smudge.
What's a pinch?
You know, right. And then you just put it in the oven and you cook it until, you know, it feels right. And it's just like, I don't even know what feels right is. And in making cheese and in making mezcal, everything is just so second nature to it. And there really isn't, you know, trying to ask somebody to go back to why is as you discovered with your grandfather, is really hard. It's just like, that's just what I did.
I personally, like, that's probably one of the more beautiful things, because I feel like in our family, especially, it's obvious that the next gen in my family, like not even my kids, like my cousins, all of our ages, because with such a variance of ages, there's a lot of older cousins, a lot of young cousins. We're not going to preserve as much of our culture, our family's history, as we would want. But I know there's a good little cohort of us who make it a point to talk to our grandfather, to understand certain things of what we've done, how we've done them, really to understand that's our why. Like, it's not because we're going to have a great, like, Webster dictionary definition of the why, but it's going to be because our grandfather used to do it that way, and we want to try and preserve that, or our grandmother used to do it that way. And it's funny, even like, this is like a very simple thing, but my grandma visited the vinata that's now on the property where she raised her kids, and she went probably about 6 months ago, and she saw our ollas de barro, because I'd mentioned, you know, in Cotija, in that region, Saguayo, and the region going towards Los Reyes, all that region is so interconnected to, like, kind of the Raicilla area of the Jalisco, because it's border. Cotija to Jalisco is like from Sonoma to Napa, not even, like, it's really, really close. And a lot of the Raicilla presence, in the sense of clay pot distillation, is present there. And so my grandma saw our ollas, and she said, you guys didn't cure those, meaning we didn't seal them properly. I'm like, and it was funny because the one batch that we did on them, we yielded so little because so much evaporated because we didn't cure them. And I was like, how the hell, how did you know that? She goes, I just saw them and I knew, I just saw them and I knew. And what you need to do is add water, cal and sal, let it boil, and it's going to, I'm like, I was just like fascinated with just like the level of knowledge just so quickly from all of the history of time, because for her, it was really making beans and foods with clay pot, not necessarily, distilling mezcal, but she knew right away that the ollas had not been properly sealed. Just, those are the kind of things I think that we're all trying to take in, to be like, those are important pieces of our history that we need to try to preserve. And some cousins, like I said, really do a good job of paying attention and writing it down and creating our family lineage to keep it alive.
Yeah. I mean, it is especially with the outside pressures to change everything for, efficiency, etc. It is really hard to try and find that balance, between the two things. So like with you, where do you see you leaving your imprint with the mezcales that you're, developing and putting out into the world?
I would say kind of what I alluded to earlier, it's very obvious that we've scaled, that we've grown as a brand. It's very obvious that our production has grown. But what I try to, at least whether someone else agrees with me or not, like I've convinced myself that every step that we do is that we're going to not change the method of how to produce our product. Meaning we have not installed brick ovens versus earth ovens, right? We have not installed stainless steel fermentation vats versus wood fermentation vats. Our stills, while we have a lot of our stills, they're all copper castles, they're all Filipino wood stills, and they're all copper cones. Like all of those things have not changed for us because it's been like a goal that, while yes, like we've grown, and fortunately so, because like I said, for me, one of the biggest motivators is the amount of people that we've been able to add to our payroll in Mexico. We have not changed that. So like the drop of mezcal that you would try on site when the mezcal breaks, when it starts, it's going to be the same as if it were, one still somewhere else in that sense. Like we're trying to preserve that history and that idea. And the one thing that's been pretty fascinating is the concept of speed, in the sense that a lot of times, one of the things that I noticed was definitely, like, for example, if Higi says, okay, we're ready to distill, the one thing that I think a lot of times is maybe not thought of is that if you start distilling and you have one still, it's there too, the amount of time it would take, because each caso is only like 200 liters of capacity, so it's not a lot, and your tina is 1,000 liters, right? So it would take 5 paradas, as we call them, to get it going. If you have 2 stills, it's going to be a couple days, right, of distilling. So for sure, if you deemed it, today's Monday, if you deemed it ready to distill today, to then you finishing on Wednesday, there's been more development in that vat. Whether you deemed it good on Monday, so maybe it changed negatively to Wednesday. Like we're not certain of those factors, but that part's been pretty curious, because we've been able to see, because of the ability to have more stills, how our product is tasting off the still, with it going through our fermentation to distillation a little bit faster.
Wow. I don't think I wouldn't have even thought of that, where it's like, well, and it's one of those duh moments where you're like, it's 2 days would add, like a difference in
it's
flavor.
In that development stage, right? Like it's still, it doesn't stop. Like it's not just going to stop abruptly. It's going to keep going. Just like with cheese, it's going to take months to finally give you your finished product. And certain salt factors are going to pop out more, certain funkinesses, all those things. So I've seen that, as for them, it's been kind of like to your point, it's been like kind of an aha moment when they're tried, like, oh, this is cool. This is great. And so it's been kind of fun. We've not stopped. We have not stopped our pursuit to challenge ourselves to represent the full state diversity of agave. I think that's one of our biggest pursuits as well, is, we've quickly grown into the biggest line of SKUs or expressions in the whole state. Like we're, at first we were 1 SKU, Cuprieta, and now we're, I think 9 expressions deep with ensembles we've done, including that clay pot one from Cotija. So that's been really cool. And I think to some degree, because of that clay pot existence in Cotija, will be a brand that from Michoacan will bring up, only because of the category and how it's split up ancestral mezcal from Michoacan, which I think will be really unique. There's not a lot of it on the market, and not ancestral.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's been pretty incredible to see how this has developed over the years, because I mean, I remember when it was just the Cupriata,
Yeah.
and and you guys were always like, we want to participate in Mexico in a bottle, and I'm like, you kind of need more than one,
Yeah. To do some, yeah, agreed. No, and I think at that point it was still the thought, but it was how we got it accomplished was not through lack of effort. I mean, it was, it took a lot of trips for me to go down there to figure out how we were setting things up so that we could be the brand we are. But, like to have Hernan and Higgy and, them be like, Hernan's young. Hernan's like 28. Higgy's,
oh my gosh.
Hernan, but they all come from mezcalero families. Higgy's been doing it since he was a young kid. And with his dad, Adan. So basically, let me see, was this label? Yeah, this is the Bruto. And it says Adan Perez and Edgar Higgy. Edgar's a son who's like 32, and Adan's a dad. And Adan obviously taught Higgy. This batch they did together. More recent batches, Higgy took on by himself. And it's really cool, like to have a really young team to try, like it's really because of intention. Like all of us are like, we want to challenge ourselves to bring the product like some wow factor in mezcal. That we're achieving it. I think that's the market's decision to decide. But we're definitely attempting it. We're definitely working hard to make sure we're representing all of the agaves. Like we did our first batch of Salmiana from Michoacan. We found Salmiana in Pátzcuaro and in Tarímbaro. And it was funny because they did it. It was the first time they worked with Salmiana. And while I tried it the other day, it was a very small batch. And I was like, I like this. This is really good. And they were like, you know what? Give us a chance. We want to do another one. Like, don't take this one. Let us do a second batch, and we're gonna buy more agave. And I'm like, okay, because it's the same challenge. It's like but to think that we're adding Salmiana from Michoacan is kind of special to me. And I'm like, I'd never even known it was, but we saw it one day. I was driving from Pátzcuaro to Pongio, and we saw a sign that said "Si hay pulque," and all they had in their backyard was Salmiana. And I was like, why have we not done Salmiana? And then we went on a horseback riding event one day, and we went through a small town, and there's like a road going up to the hills to get to back home. It was all Salmiana, but no one touches it. They're using it a lot for like fence barriers, like it's like mostly, but it's all Salmiana. I'm like, this is fucking amazing. Like we're gonna be able to do more Salmiana in the future because of these people, And so and we're gonna keep on doing that. If we find agave in the state, like it's gonna go into production for us to try to, and it's challenging though, because for them, first time working with agaves, I have realized like every single agave has its different complexities. We're not used to, it's definitely not turnkey. It's not like, hey, here's your Bruto, treat it like Cuprieta, or there's some overlap, but definitely not turnkey at all, or like straightforward.
Yeah. Oh no, there's definitely distinctions. And I have to say, like, I have come to really love Salmiana as a mezcal. Like
me too.
I mean, it is amazing how much flavor comes out of it. And when I've had lower proof Salmianas, like I'm just like, really, this is just 40%, because there's an awful lot of flavor in this, where it's just, it's got something as an agave. But yeah, I think you have to know what you're doing when you're working with it.
And it's, and we're learning step by step. And by the time 2021 comes around, with the exception of finding new one in 2021, new agave in the state, we're probably gonna have experience with almost all of them. So I feel like the one thing about hopefully us and as a team and as a brand is we're hopefully just ascending. We're all growing together and still trying to get better. And by next year in 2022, we'll have incorporated and worked with all agaves already more than once, and the products will be stellar in that sense because of the practice. So, but yeah, to your point, I went to San Luis Potosí just more from like an investigative, trying to try it out. And I remember I went to 3 areas. One I was really not impressed, but it seemed a lot more commercial in a lot of ways. The other 2, I was just fascinated. The lack of cold water the lack of water that they had. Period. How they worked with their still, like just looking at. And I remember one of the guys that went with us right away was like, "Oh, how they could do that better?" In my head, I'm like, "Just stop there, because have you tried this stuff? There's nothing they need to do better. Like these guys kill it." And it was one of the most eye-opening times. I think we all looked at each other and were like, we got a long ways to go. But these guys are killing it. And just seeing how they cook, which it wasn't, they were using all the bagazo, which I thought was super healthy, right? Like no wood for cooking, but it still cooked well. a lot of things that like concept. I remember going when we were driving up there, Hernan especially was like kind of complaining about we had some water issues in and I think it was a Tucuaro, and then I was listening, and then we got, and the guy who's taking us was like, wait, he goes, you guys have no idea what water issues until you visit where we're going. I'm like, where are we gonna see? He's like, I'm not gonna tell you until we get there. And we all got there solid. And we all kind of like, we're like, there's no water issues in Michoacán. We're in a very good situation. These guys have every water issue you could think of.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is a really, well, I mean, necessity is the mother of all inventions.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and the thing that struck me in San Luis Potosí is, you know, this is an incredible place. There is so much agave to be found here. And the limitations are water.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's especially because they were steaming agave in a lot of the haciendas.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, you know, so it was a really, you know, a whole bunch of different factors there. But I want to be mindful of everybody's time and just say, you know, like, who's got questions? We've got the Q&A, or you can put it in the chat function. There's a chance to ask whatever question you want, whether or not we'll answer is the, you know, of course we'll answer. But
I saw that Patricia asked about if it was rennet, and
rennet.
Yeah, cuajo is
Mhm.
rennet. Like that's
Yeah.
what they're the same thing. Yeah, but that's cool. Well, I'll let questions come in. But the one thing I noticed is, I know that cheese making today has a lot of different things to add to it, and literally just being rennet as the one thing they add to then create the cheese, I think it's pretty special.
Yeah, it's true. We might have been so complete in what we talked about that that there aren't questions. I mean, I will say, you know, in the times that I haven't been able to find cotija cheese, or I didn't have it on hand, if I was cooking, you know, I would substitute in Parmesan,
Yeah.
which, you know, same but different, and you know, the flavor. Having the cheese that you sent me is the reminder that, well, it's not the same at all.
Yeah, no. I think that Cotija benefits from the fact that it won, I forget which year it was. It was within the it was after the year 2000, the world's best cheese. But to your point, like, there's other areas that produce amazing cheese in Mexico. They're just not on the map in that sense because they didn't win the world's best cheese. But even our neighbor in Sahuayo, they have a queso Sahuayo that I've had the chance to taste. And it tastes so similar to queso Cotija. It's just a different region, some other variances, including obviously the terroir of the area. But yeah, I mean, I think Mexico and even its cheese recognition is going to grow.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Oh, what was the name of the brand of mezcal Samiana you liked in San Luis Potosí?
It was Campanilla. It was Campanilla. It was a region actually called Campanilla, and the families worked with that being their brand name, but each producer had a different color label. And I got a chance to meet the I think it was the father of one of them. And it was cool just to like hear, like, the one thing that was really special was that no one had changed anything. It was all like, literally, I mean, I'm sure they have Facebook or YouTube, and they could have changed a shitload of stuff. They didn't change anything. And it was like, this is really cool.
Yep. I mean, I know that Eric Rodriguez of Alma Mezcalera works with producers in Campanilla, and his product is now available in the United States. And I think they have it at Old Town Tequila, specifically the San Luis Potosí.
The Rumbes Salmiana from San Luis is really good and really well priced. So that's another one that's a no-brainer for me. If you see it and you can get it, just snatch it, because it's a great offering.
Yeah, I will second that. It has kind of become one of my go-to mezcals in the house. And yeah, the Campanilla one is very much a tiny production. And when you see how it's made, you understand why it's priced the way that it is. Because it is incredibly labor intensive. But I think, you know, much like as we've seen with the evolution of mezcal and mezcal finding its place in the market, and then the demand for other agave distillates that has grown out of that. And now we're kind of seeing the birthing of the different Mexican craft spirits. You know, so So the corn whiskeys, there's some interesting gins, there are liqueurs. I think that Mexican cheese will eventually find its place outside. Although I'm torn on that. Does it need to? It's like it's yet another reason to travel, and at some point we all will travel again.
True.
I hope. I'm bummed because this was the year I was actually going to go to Michoacan.
Well, we'll have to wait a little bit, but
yeah, we'll have to wait a little bit.
In due time,
Yep.
we'll grow impatient, and we'll have to.
Yep.
Yeah,
It's
and
very
full
good.
invitation to anyone that ever wants to go to what we do. It's always open, and it's open invitation. We're happy to host anybody.
Yep. Cool. No more questions or anything. I will say okay. I guess Chris Maxwell would like to come soon.
Yeah, I know. We had a trip planned. I mean, not officially a date, but we had talked about it. But yeah, this whole thing sucked. But yeah, we'll do it soon, very soon.
Yep. So I would just like to say, Sal, thank you so much for your time.
Likewise,
I
thank
greatly
you.
appreciate it. I love the fact that you were totally down with the topic when I pitched it your way, and you were like, "Okay, let's do it."
Let's do it for sure.
So,
always
thank
happy
you,
to chat.
thank
I
you.
appreciate the invitation, and thank you everyone who joined.
Yep. And for those of you who would like to pick up some La Luna Mezcal online, probably Old Town Tequila, I think, has your whole line.
Have the whole line. They should, yeah.
Have the whole line available. They can ship pretty much anywhere in San Francisco in the Bay Area. I think Cask, K&L, and Healthy Spirits are the three that.
And if there's any local stores that you guys go to, at this point we moved distribution recently, and I know it's very easy for any store to order a bottle or 2 bottles or whatever. So if you guys need a special order, I'm sure your local store can fulfill it pretty easily.
Yep, cool. All right, thank you all. And then next week, be sure to join us. We'll be back again with Leon Lori Langel. If you've ever been to Oaxaca, years ago he worked at Los Amantes. Now he's worked at Chalaparta Bar. Pretty much if you've tried mezcal, he's probably been the one serving it to you. And we're just looking forward to talking to him and really understanding the changing landscape of mezcal in Oaxaca. But until then, we'll get the link out to everybody later this week. And I hope everybody has a great week. All right. Thank you very much.
You.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.